And what the Negro leader has done is gotten himself wrapped up in the method and has forgotten what the goal is. The goal is the dignity of the black man in America. He wants respect as a human being. He wants recognition as a human being. Now, if integration will get him that, all right. If segregation will get him that, all right. If separation will get him that, all right. But after he gets integration and he still doesn't have this dignity and this recognition as a human being, then his problem is still not solved. I don't think you can, having an opportunity to ride either on the front or the back or in the middle of someone else's bus doesn't dignify you. When you have your own bus, then you have dignity. When you have your own school, you have dignity. When you have your own country, you have dignity. When you have something of your own, you have dignity. But whenever you are begging for a chance to participate in that which belongs to someone else, or use that which belongs to someone else on an equal basis with the owner, that's not dignity, that's ignorance.
At 26 years old and 1,000 miles from his wife, his newborn daughter, and his home, Otis Howard found purpose, stationed among the swampy, unforgiving terrain of Tampa, Florida in 1857. The young lieutenant attended a Methodist event where he would strengthen his faith and will to persist while serving an assignment that was weary at his best. He had come up in life despite losing his father at 10 and being raised by extended family. A West Point graduate, Howard was well prepared to follow his mission, whatever it may be, to the highest levels of federal government. Always considering God's purpose for him, he spent his life on ambitious journeys beset through his faith. Setbacks, defeats, and the extreme loss in the Civil War would batter him, but not in his resolve. And following the Union's victory, Howard would lead a Reconstruction program centered on providing well-being for 4 million newly freed men, women, and children. Facing the difficult realities of his mission, he resolved that education was essential, and in 1867 secured a federal charter for the institution that would become his namesake, Howard University. The institution would provide recently freed men and women the opportunity to earn an education, which Howard considered the true relief from beggary and dependence. General Howard and the university that bears his name parallel in the history that followed, one that saw their emergence and resignation within the societal traditions that housed them and are foundational to their legacies. The United States in 1857 was rife with tension over the increasing concern of abolition of slavery. Abolition had been a fierce point of political contention in the earlier decades, and terror and violence increased against abolitionists by pro-slavery groups. The divide between anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces had reached a critical mass in 1854 over the issue of the organization of territorial governments in Kansas and Nebraska. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed Kansas residents to decide whether they wanted the state to be a slave state or a free one. Pro-slavery militias, abolitionists, and anti-slavery statesmen all targeted Kansas as an emerging political epicenter, as its 2 Senate seats would either benefit prolonging or ending slavery through majority influence in the upper house of the Senate. This would yield a period remembered as Bleeding Kansas, which was a time of sustained violence along the borders of Kansas for the political future of the state. 2 years following the act, in May of 1856, Charles Sumner, a Republican member of the Senate, was brutally attacked by House of Representatives member Preston Brooks with a cane in the Senate upper house. Retaliation for Sumner's anti-slavery speech he delivered to the Senate 2 days earlier. The Dred Scott Supreme Court decision of 1857 declared that blacks, enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States and hence could not claim U.S. citizenship or petition a court for freedom. That summer, in Springfield, Illinois, a 48-year-old lawyer named Abraham Lincoln spoke against this decision as a member of the newly formed Republican Party, having refined an anti-slavery rhetoric the decade prior while serving as a congressman in the House of Representatives. Lincoln refuted the idea that the founding fathers intended to exclude blacks from the phrase "the people" as it applied to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Lincoln would rise to national attention because of his widely reported debates with Stephen Douglas in the Illinois Senate campaign of 1858. In a notable speech Lincoln delivered in Springfield in July of that year, he declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Lincoln was considered a moderate among the Republicans at the time, and they established him as a leader of what might be considered a centrist faction of the party. But the tone of the 1860 presidential campaign was anything but moderate. Slavery was the central issue, and Lincoln, while he wanted to eventually end what he called the peculiar institution, favored as an interim step the exclusion of slavery from the new American territories. This infuriated leaders in the slave states, who were in no mood to compromise. Stephen Douglas, who had defeated Lincoln in that Senate campaign 2 years earlier, was his main competitor again in the presidential contest. Douglas had a more favorable view of slavery, advocating its continuation in the states where it already existed. Douglas, in fact, envisioned a nation forever divided into free and slave states, as our fathers made it, as the people of each state have decided. Lincoln won with 1,866,452 votes without carrying a single Southern state. Following the election, Lincoln immediately was thrown into the cauldron of crisis, following the advice of bodyguards who were worried about assassination attempts en route to his inauguration in Washington. The president-elect changed trains in Baltimore to confuse his enemies and disguised himself in a soft hat and overcoat. His train moved through Baltimore before dawn without incident and arrived in Washington in secret. On March 4, 1861, he rode in a heavily guarded open carriage to the Capitol and gave his inaugural address. He spoke directly to the South. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of Civil War," the new commander-in-chief declared. "The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." He added, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, and surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." But hope for conciliation was a futile one. With the national government finally in anti-slavery hands, the South proceeded to secede. By the time Lincoln took the oath of office, in fact, a Confederate government under Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator, was already in place. The Civil War erupted on April 12, 1861, and ripped the United States in two distinct halves. Otis Howard, a young lieutenant and devout man of faith, supported the Union cause. South Carolina, a slave state, was the first to secede from the Union following the election of Abraham Lincoln, followed in order by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Seceding states cited the ability to enforce and preserve the institution of slavery as a driving factor for secession, charging non-slave-holding states with gradually undermining the potential of slave states to preserve the institution. The undermining of the fugitive slave law was repeatedly cited across state declarations of secession statements, and the angst between slave states and free states was at its height prior to the election of Abraham Lincoln. Mississippi's Declaration of Secession acknowledged this in regards to slavery. "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow against slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition, or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work out our ruin." Howard's support of the Union had coincided with his growing devotion to abolition and his representation as his purpose from God. Though persistent and spiritually driven, Howard would soon bear witness to the cost of reform through the Civil War. as he suffered considerable losses in major battles. The Battle of Fair Oaks in June 1862 left him with only his left arm, as his right was amputated following a gunshot wound. Howard remained motivated, writing to the New York Times on New Year's Day in 1863, "We must destroy slavery, root and branch." Despite his resolve, Howard would face more hardship in combat. The Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863 left him with a damaged reputation, as his troops were ambushed and routed following his failure to acknowledge warnings of an incoming attack. As his reputation began to suffer, the soldiers of his command would start referring to him as O.O. Howard, a play on the letters of his name, Otis Oliver Howard. After being moved to the Western Theater, Howard demonstrated competent leadership in subsequent battles, like the Battle of Chattanooga, and gradually improved his reputation. On January 16, 1865, when the Civil War approached its end, General William T. Sherman issued the Special Order No. 15. The order confiscated land corresponding to an area of approximately 400,000 acres along the Atlantic coast, from Charleston, South Carolina, to Florida's St. Johns River. Following the Union's victory in 1865, General Howard took an opportunity to lead the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Land, established in the same year and developed to aid some 4 million newly free people in establishing a livelihood. Before his assassination in April of 1865, President Abraham Lincoln personally selected General Howard to be the leader of the Freedmen's Bureau. Howard would be its central figure and the only head the Bureau would ever have, an agency of the War Department and staffed by Army officers. The Bureau distributed food, clothing, and other supplies while providing job placements, homestead land, and educational facilities. One of his major successes was to provide schools and teachers for the freedmen. Thousands of freed blacks of all ages crowded into small one-room schoolhouses day and night to become literate. In 1865, reflecting to an audience in Augusta, Maine, on his intentions for the freedmen under the Freedmen's Bureau policies, Howard stated, "The government has solemnly promised to them their freedom and the fruits of freedom. It will keep that promise. I think that all we have to do is to aim at absolute justice to blacks and whites, watching the signs of the times, and keeping a steady rein. I believe that when God sent us forth to liberate this oppressed race, He did not mean that they should be wholly engulfed. He intended that they should be free, and free to some purpose. If we attempt to re-enslave them or to bind any heavy burdens upon them, He will chasten us again and again." With this consideration in mind, Howard worked steadfastly to develop policies that would allow freedmen the freedom to choose their own employers, to work independent of any overseer systems, to receive assistance in obtaining titles to lands previously confiscated and abandoned, and to receive equal justice under their local law, all substantiated by protection from federal troops under Bureau domain. Another major focus of Howard's planning was to coordinate resources with the Freedmen's Aid Society, developed from the American Missionary Association, that had been stood up previously in the abolitionist-friendly North. Aid societies had predominantly stemmed from various religious denominations, like Presbyterians, which had been active in abolitionist work and in relief measures during the Civil War. Supporting these groups was determined to be of crucial importance, as they would provide most of the teachers and a large part of the financing of schools and orphanages for the freedmen. The emerging opportunity to aid freedmen was met eagerly by such groups as the Union Aid Commission, made up of previously established aid societies, and the American Missionary Association of the Congregational Church. These organizations became the most prominent bodies in establishing schools for freedmen, with support from the Bureau in transportation and rations. But this great humanitarian effort was short-lived. In October of 1865, Howard was dispatched on a tour throughout the South to reinstate lands to former Confederate soldiers whose land had been confiscated in the war effort. The former Confederates had been pardoned that summer by President Andrew Johnson, who ordered Howard to officially reinstate them to their former holdings before presenting the newly freedmen with this information. This news would present a grave reversal of fortunes to the freedmen, as they had begun settling along confiscated and abandoned lands and had found considerable success in the immediate aftermath of the war and resettlement. One such group of freedmen were the formerly enslaved people among the Sea Islands, islands on the Atlantic coast of the southeastern United States. Early in the war, the Union forces had occupied the Sea Islands and allocated to newly freedmen the plantations of their former enslavers. Additionally, thousands more freedmen fled to the islands and settled successfully following General William T. Sherman's march to the sea, which yielded the scorched earth policy that ultimately led to Union victory. Howard recognized the freedmen's success on the sea islands in the post-war climate and used their demonstration of persistence and resilience to inform his decision to order that the remaining confiscated lands be issued to freedmen in the summer of 1865, prior to the Confederate pardons. Howard had remarked that the freed people there had passed happily from a state of bondage to the condition of freemen, adding, "Those interesting people are comparatively happy. They work diligently, they raise good crops, and they are more prosperous than they ever dared to hope for in their wildest dreams." During his trip through the South, the general was constantly at work. Everywhere he stopped, freed men and women crowded churches and homes to see him speak. Their applause rattled the windows. They stood to praise the work of the Bureau. They delighted him with hymns such as "O Jordan's Stormy Banks," declaring, "I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me?" In once grand homes now occupied by Union officers, Howard met with Bureau officials and learned how they expected the freed people to suffer in the coming winter. Not enough warm clothes or medicine or food. All the while, Howard was also meeting with former rebels who were back in control in North and South Carolina. People who, Roland, Howard's brother, reported were whipped but proud again, with the idea that President Johnson is on their side. Newspapers raged against the Bureau. Women, well-dressed ladies, Howard's brother wrote him, utter in now hissing tones those hated words, "These Yankees." In tense rooms, Southern politicians received General Howard dead and cold, demanding the withdrawal of your troops, your bureau, your school, and everything else. This setting weighed heavily on Howard when he arrived among the Sea Island settlements in the fall of 1865 to inform the freedmen of their incoming masters and of their prospects for work being reduced to securing contracts under the pardoned group. Howard later wrote of being sad and chagrined, and years later remarked, "Why did I not resign?" before answering, "Because I even yet strongly hoped in some way to befriend the freed people." After arriving at Edisto, Howard was met by the freed people with great enthusiasm, as he had come to be seen as a champion of their cause. This reception, however, would soon be overtaken with dread, as they saw him being accompanied by a lawyer who had been soliciting them to leave the land in favor of the former Confederates who had owned it previously. Thousands gathered at a church and, sensing what news was to come, began singing, "Nobody knows the trouble I feel. Nobody knows but Jesus." Following the song, Howard stood and explained to them that the lands they had resettled would be returned to their former masters, before urging them to make contracts with the parting group. Cries of "no" came from the audience before one man shouted, "Why, General Howard, why do you take away our lands? You take them away from us who are true, always true to the government. You give them to our all-time enemies. That is not right." Another man acknowledged that he had lived all his life with a basket over his head, and now that it had been taken off and air and sunlight had come to him, he could not consent to have the basket over him again. It was a painful moment as recorded by many who witnessed it, and moments like it would take place throughout the South as the confiscated lands were reinstated to former Confederates. The freed people of Edisto vowed to leave the land in the days following Howard's address, as it was understood among them that property, a homestead, would determine the difference between their freedom and slavery. The following year of 1866 yielded a summer of violence against the freedmen, as riots enacted by former white militias throughout the South terrorized freedmen, many newly active in politics, and left dozens dead in instances like in Memphis, which recorded 46 freedmen killed on May 3rd of 1866, and in New Orleans with 34 to 50 freedmen casualties in July of the same year. Southern states passed new laws known as black codes, aimed at imposing slavery by another name. For example, Mississippi demanded that freed people carry proof they had entered into a labor contract or they could be imprisoned. The law also forbade African Americans from renting or leasing land. In South Carolina, blacks unwilling to be farm workers had to get special permission from a court. But throughout the South, freedmen refused to go back. They organized into union leagues, defended each other from attacks from white militias, and organized boycotts and strikes to prevent plantation owners from imposing slavery-like conditions. They organized political conventions across the South in states like South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina to collectively express their goals, protest the black codes, and demand the right to vote, to receive schooling, to earn wages, and to have access to land. freedmen marched, protested, and inundated Congress with petitions and resolutions. Their efforts were successful. When Congress convened in 1866, they refused to seat the delegates from Johnson's state governments, many of them former Confederates. They drafted the Civil Rights Act of 1866 on April 9th, which outlined the policies that would later be drafted into the 14th Amendment, which declared the freedmen as citizens whose rights could not be violated by laws like the Black Codes. Howard remained steadfast and committed to addressing the needs of the freedmen, and the decision to create what became known as Howard University was made in a prayer meeting at the First Congressional Church in Washington, D.C. on November 20th, 1866. The plan called for a school to train preachers colored with a view to service among the freedmen. Soon after, the organizers, in recognition of Howard's major role, proposed that the school be named the Howard Normal and Theological Institute for the education of teachers and preachers. This title was not satisfactory, however, and on March 2nd, 1867, the school was chartered under the name of Howard University. It is striking that the primary motive for establishing Howard was the same for all early colleges in the nation, like Harvard and Yale. The primary emphasis of the 9 colleges that predate the American Revolution and that survived today was on the training of preachers and other leaders. The school was situated on a hilltop, the site of a former slave plantation. Howard was the school's 3rd president and entered actively into the life of the university. Each morning, except Friday, he conducted a chapel service for all the students, reading the scripture and leading in the prayers. "Our chapel room is pretty well filled," he once described the scene. Perhaps 200 student boys on the north and girls on the south side facing west look up to me at the desk, and the teachers ranging right and left along the raised platform. Oh, such congregational singing. Nothing excels this. There is resting by and by, near my God to thee, Jesus, lover of my soul. Such hymns make your heart swell and the tears come. After chapel, he would go directly to his office in the same building and start the day's bureau work. He also held Bible recitations for an hour every Monday morning. While Congress had successfully overridden a veto in 1866 from President Andrew Johnson and managed to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, by 1868, it was unwilling to sustain the cost of aiding the freedmen beyond educational and bounty-paying branches. By 1870, the Bureau had lost its funding for education and ended its activities in the South. Consequently, freedmen were forced to rely on their own meager resources as they faced the future. It was believed that the new Reconstruction state governments, at the time in most instances controlled by Republican regimes, would protect the interests of the freedmen. By the 1870s, however, these governments had lost their hold, and the enthusiasm for the cause in Congress and in the North generally had died down. The nation, both North and South, seemed unprepared to extend full equality to the freedmen. The Freedmen's Bureau was officially dissolved in 1872. The decision to discontinue the Bureau was a political one, as the federal government grew more ill-favored in the eyes of the general public. The public spotlight on government corruption was amplified with revelations surrounding the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. During the same year of 1872, financial relationships between congressional officials and railroad companies were uncovered. As stakeholders of a railroad company, Credit Mobilier laced officials in Congress in their business. The stakeholders, it turned out, were also the directors of the Union Pacific Railroad Company, who was awarded government contracts to develop the Transcontinental Railroad. As overt corruption within the developing railroad industry became more transparent, a growing consensus across the country was that government intervention was ill-fated and irresponsible. This consensus led to the Panic of 1873, a financial crisis that triggered an economic depression in Europe and North America that lasted until 1879. Howard, as leader of the Freedmen's Bureau, had come to be seen by prominent figures of the federal government as unaccountable and potentially corrupt. He was tried repeatedly in court for corruption. Having been given substantial direction on how the Bureau could spend its funds, Howard greatly funded his university namesake. The initial grant for Howard University was $150,000 and yielded Howard a sizable home on an acre of land. The home, along with the university buildings, was built with bricks produced by a company that Howard started with fellow Bureau officials. This arrangement was eventually brought under scrutiny following the collapse of 2 walls of an unfinished hospital building during a heat wave. Howard argued that he developed a means to employ university students, and no profit was made by his business. Dating back to 1865, Howard had acknowledged the need of employment for freedmen in his first letter to his bureau officers, stating in regards to the freedmen, on no account, if able to work, should he harbor the thought that the government will support him in idleness. In his second letter to his officials, he wrote, the able-bodied should be encouraged and, if necessary, compelled to labor for their own support. In addition to the scandal surrounding his business, Howard also presided over an ill-fated placement of bureau funds. A financial officer tasked by Howard with directing bounty payments allocated bounty money to a private account in order to receive a good return on the Bureau's funds. Tens of thousands of dollars went missing under this arrangement, with Howard accountable for the loss. The charges of corruption levied against General Howard thus reflected public perceptions that informed politics then and now, that government assistance with social welfare programs and infrastructure represented fiscal mismanagement, that such assistance would undermine human resilience in favor of dependency, that citizens using these resources would stagnate in professional and social development, and that ultimately this would yield government encroachment on individual liberty through increased influence on citizens' lives. The scandal surrounding the Freedmen's Bureau and the Transcontinental Railroad were ultimately personified and satirized in Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner's 1873 novel on political corruption, The Gilded Age. At the end of 1873, Howard resigned from the university's presidency because he expected soon to have an active army command. Howard, hoping to revitalize his reputation and searching for a new purpose from God, had accepted an assignment to facilitate the settling of homesteaders on Native American ancestral lands in what is now Oregon. This assignment was seen by his peers at the time as an exile, but facing opposition on all fronts in a Washington, D.C., controlled by his political adversaries, the general was more than willing to take it on. With financial troubles brought on by the Panic of 1873, the end of Bureau aid, and the absence of Howard's stabilizing influence, Howard University experienced a period of financial instability, which continued until the end of the decade. In early 1874, Howard was called by congressional Democrats to pay back the missing funds himself and was tried before 7 Army officers convened in a special court of inquiry by President Ulysses S. Grant. The Secretary of War outlined the corruption charges to be levied against Howard, and he faced heavy criticism during his trial. Howard was ultimately found innocent on the charges, with the court remarking that he did his whole duty and deserves well of his country. Despite his favorable verdict, Howard again suffered a loss of reputation. Following his exoneration, newspapers across the country continued to debate his guilt. Humiliated, Howard wrote of being crippled and broken, nearly bankrupted from the cost of lawyers. I risk everything for the president's policy and am rewarded with charges, he wrote following his trial, before adding, I say this without bitterness, but yet think it is true. In what came to be known as the Compromise of 1877, the last remaining federal troops in the South were withdrawn in exchange for the election of the Republican candidate for president, Rutherford B. Hayes, thus effectively ending Reconstruction. Reconstruction, despite its dismantling, had left considerable gains in the legislated rights of freedmen, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, known as the Reconstruction Amendments, yielding the official abolishment of slavery, except as punishment for a crime, equal protection of the rights of citizens under the law, and the prohibition of federal government in each state from denying male citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. However, the shift in American policy toward government intervention on behalf of the freedmen was too brief to have had a lasting effect on generations of deprivation. The Bureau, for a time, looked as if it could have made substantive changes in the social order of the South. What followed Reconstruction was basically the continuation of the policy of subjugation and oppression. After a brief experience with participatory democracy, freedmen and their allies were for all practical purposes eliminated from one state after another from so-called radical influence. This so-called radical influence was amplified as subversive by its opponents in the post-Civil War climate. The opposition of Reconstruction would contribute greatly to the political ideology of that time and contemporary politics today, with focus on fiscal responsibility, with particular interest in deficits in spending and securing voter bases through catering to rural, familial sensibilities developed predominantly in the South, where landowners and slave owners carried preeminence in state politics. If General Howard lacked anything in relationship to his mission, it was the political prominence needed in the South, where plantation life was foundational to industry. Despite having founded a university that represented the positive potential of the large social welfare programs of Reconstruction, General Howard, scorned by his political adversaries, was facing potential ruin in his immediate life to come. Resignation is regarded as the acceptance of something undesirable but inevitable. Over the span of Howard University's history, its presidents, regardless of their contributions, worked within a system that required their resignation. Howard's first 5 presidents witnessed during Reconstruction the divestment from and destruction of programs that had supplanted the university. Otis Howard, the third of these presidents and the founder of the university, had acknowledged the improvement of the lives of freedmen to be his mission from God, but would ultimately see his reputation, finances, and life's work upended as the Union government he supported lost dominance at the state and federal level. Having resumed his new assignment in Oregon, General Howard was facing a polarizing new mission, one that would further alienate him in his quest to enrich lives, one that would continue to mirror the history of his namesake.